Today we're talking about adolescence. Probably, in my opinion, one of the more interesting time periods to talk about. Very tumultuous time in development, as I'm sure you all remember fondly. So adolescence runs maybe a little bit later than you would think. So it goes from 12 until at least 19. And some researchers even count adolescence up until about like 21, because there's some pretty interesting brain developments happening up until like early 20s. So I would say definitely 12 to 19, maybe up to 21-ish is the age range we're talking about here. So if we're talking about physical changes in adolescence, you can probably assume that puberty is going to be a huge part of that. So puberty leads to all kinds of really dramatic changes in our physical appearance, and it also impacts the brain in really significant ways that we'll talk about. And then in the next PowerPoint, we'll also talk about how puberty affects our emotions and social interactions. Because of some of the changes in the brain, adolescents are much more prone than other time periods to engage in some really risky behaviors. So we'll talk a little bit about some of the brain changes that contribute to that. And then we'll also talk about some cognitive developments in things like reasoning abilities and scientific understanding. So that's the plan for today. So let's start with puberty. So kind of the main thing that's driving a lot of the changes that you experience during puberty are in hormonal changes. So, all genders have some growth hormones that are contributing to overall physical growth. The main ones are thyroxine, and then there's also a hormone that's literally just called growth hormone. So growth hormone and thyroxine are the two biggest hormones that are contributing to just like overall growth, where you get another growth spurt around this time around puberty. And then in addition to those, there are also what we call the sex hormones. And sex hormones tend to differ based on gender. So the two biggest groups of sex hormones are androgens and estrogens. Androgens would include things like testosterone, for example, is the biggest one. And androgens tend to be more active in cisgender boys. And then estrogens are more active in cisgendered girls, although all genders have a little bit of each of those. There's like this imbalance between the genders. So the androgens, again, that would be like testosterone. They tend to contribute to like hair growth all over the body. They contribute to the growth spurts that cis boys experience during this time, and particular to the development of muscles. And they also increase metabolism and tend to like broaden the shoulders. And then the estrogens, that would include estrogen and progesterone, are the two big estrogen sex hormones. Again, they tend to be more active in cisgendered girls. They're going to stimulate like growth of the breast tissue. They help with maturation of the genitals in females, the vagina. They also contribute to like fat storage in particular areas. So cis girls tend to develop fat mostly in like the thighs and the hips. And then importantly, those estrogens also trigger the menstrual cycle. So these hormonal changes are going to contribute to a lot of the primary and secondary sexual characteristics. So primary sexual characteristics are basically the genitals. And then secondary sex characteristics are the things that we can mostly see. So things that are visible, like largening of the breasts, growth of facial hair, etc. There tend to be pretty large individual differences in the onset of puberty. So it can happen as early as like 9 or 10 in some cases. And then as late as 14 or 15. It's a pretty normal range for the start of puberty. And those differences can actually impact the genders in different ways. So there's pretty good evidence that girls who are early bloomers, like girls who have puberty earlier, tend to have worse outcomes than girls who are late bloomers. So girls who are early bloomers, they tend to have issues with like self-esteem and self-confidence. They tend to be much more uncomfortable physically in their body. They also tend to be like bullied and ostracized more. And for boys, it's basically the opposite. So boys who tend to be early bloomers, if they start puberty earlier, they're going to grow to a taller height sooner. They're going to, build up muscle sooner. And so they tend to have better social outcomes compared to boys who tend to be late bloomers. So if you have a boy that hasn't gone through puberty until fairly late, then they're much more likely to be ostracized or bullied. Also, kind of interesting note, age of puberty onset has been decreasing for some reason since the early 1900s. Like overall as a whole population, we tend to start puberty earlier now compared to then. Part of that might actually be a healthy thing. So in the early 1900s, more people were more likely to be suffering from like malnutrition. And we know that things like malnutrition can actually delay the onset of puberty. So that might be part of that reason for puberty onset age decreasing now, because we have much more access to, better health outcomes, better nutrition, etc. Another thing I want to talk about a little bit really quickly is the use of puberty blockers during this age. It's kind of a controversial subject for some people. But puberty blockers are usually used, they're used for a lot of contexts, but the part that's controversial is when they're used for someone who's transitioning from their birth gender to their gender identity. And basically what puberty blockers do, it's in the name, they're like a medication you take that basically stops the hormones, the sex hormones, from being produced as much. And so it will temporarily stop puberty. So it'll stop a lot of the processes that we just talked about. Someone who takes puberty blockers, they can basically stop taking them at any point, and then their puberty would resume just like normal, like it would have if they had never stopped or started taking the puberty blockers. So kind of the idea is that, like, let's say, for example, you have someone who's born a female and they want to transition to male. Whenever they start to go through puberty, their body's going to start pumping out all these estrogens that might start to cause, breast growth, etc. And if they want to transition to male, they identify as male, that's going to make them extremely uncomfortable, likely. So these puberty blockers would stop that process. It would basically shut down the body pumping out that estrogen. So they would kind of remain in this like pre-puberty state for a little bit. Some people choose to do that basically to delay puberty so that they have more time to make decisions. So if it's, most of the time if someone's transitioning, they're pretty much 100% certain that's what they want to do. But if for some reason they're a little bit on the fence, they think they want to transition, they're not really sure, then those puberty blockers kind of stop them from developing these sexual characteristics for a little bit, so they have more time to think about it and decide. Yeah, Ashley?
That's sexual maturation, is what you're talking about?
Yeah, that would be a part of that. So puberty blockers basically would stop that sexual maturation process, yeah. And then, most people, the huge majority of people, if they are transitioning and they take the puberty blockers, then they will eventually follow that up by doing hormone replacement therapy using the sex hormone of the gender they're trying to transition to, right? So again, if you have someone who's born female, but they want to transition to male, they might take the puberty blockers to stop the growth of breasts and all of that, and then eventually they'll take the testosterone in order to basically start developing like male sexual characteristics. Yeah.
Isn't one of the drugs, I forget the name of it, but wasn't it used to like chemically castrate sex offenders?
I don't know. I've never heard that, but that would, I could imagine that if, like, for example, if there's one that blocks testosterone, if you took it in a high enough dose, then it might, stop the production of testosterone, which would shut down sperm production. So that's possible. I've never heard that, though.
Shutting down any hormone production is going to kill someone's sex drive.
Yeah.
I think no matter what.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, it's possible.
They say it doesn't happen on like hormonal birth control, but it totally does.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, there's all kinds of effects of hormonal birth control that are not taken as seriously as they should be, probably. But
would that be the same as birth control?
Essentially, so if you have, let's see, the opposite, right? You have someone who's born male, they want to transition to female, then they would take the puberty blockers, and then later on they would supplement with estrogens, which would be... Yes. Yeah, so birth control would have very similar effects and would fall in the same kind of category, yeah. So some of the controversy or the criticisms of puberty blockers. One is fairly valid, which is that puberty blockers tend to decrease bone density. So another thing that these sexual hormones do is that they help strengthen and grow the bones. And so if you're blocking puberty, if you're blocking those hormones during puberty, even if someone then starts taking the hormone supplements later, or they stop taking puberty blockers, they still aren't going to develop the same bone density as someone who's just allowed to go through puberty naturally. Yeah.
Sorry, does it affect long-term fertility?
I would imagine so. I don't remember reading that directly, but yeah, I would imagine that it probably would. Yeah.
Possibly.
Yeah, so there are side effects, but I mean, obviously there's side effects to all kinds of medications, and people make decisions based on mitigating risk and weighing benefits, et cetera. Another common criticism you hear that's much less valid is the concern that, what if someone changes their mind? So kind of the idea is that if you have someone who's 12, are they able to make a lifelong decision that they're not going to regret? And if they do take these puberty blockers and start transitioning, and then they get to 18 and they decide like, oh, this was a bad choice, then, that might have negative outcomes. However, statistically, about 99% of people who choose to take puberty blockers are happy with that decision in adulthood. 98% of them will go on to do other transitional therapies. So if they start taking the puberty blockers, it's a very, very high chance that they will follow through with the hormone replacement therapy, and in a lot of cases also might follow through with like surgeries. Yeah.
I heard of this other study, it was a long time ago, and I can't remember the name of the guy, but I think he was Canadian.
Mm-hmm.
And he did I think it was a longitudinal study on adolescents who had gender dysphoria.
Yep.
And I feel like crap that I didn't remember the name of it, but he said that a majority of the children that he studied ended up by the age of 18 just detransitioning, I suppose.
Mm-hmm.
I think he ended up like losing his license for it.
Interesting.
Yeah. Canadian, can't trust those Canadians.
Right, yeah.
I'm just kidding.
Yeah, I mean, most of the studies I've read, like I said, say that 99% of them end up being happy with it. So,
That's what I'm wondering. Is like,
maybe in that particular case, he was pressuring people to do it for some reason. I mean, who knows? And also just to put that into context, so if 99% are happy with it, that means about 1% end up regretting the decision. About 1.2% of people regret getting LASIK eye surgery because it, has like long-term side effects, can have dry eyes and stuff. So pretty much any medical procedure you can think of course, there's going to be people who end up regretting doing that procedure because there's complications or things that they didn't think through. So, that's often one of the arguments that's used to say we shouldn't let people use puberty blockers. In my opinion, it's not a very great argument against it. So kind of like, I think we talked about this last time, this idea that if you have someone in late childhood who's expressing, wanting to transition, then it's good to support that. Same thing here in general. If in adolescence someone is wanting to transition genders, all the evidence suggests that the best outcomes are going to come from supporting that decision. And if they're not supported, that can often lead to, depression, anxiety, suicidal thoughts and tendencies. So really negative outcomes if you don't try to accept their transition. Yeah.
I also read somewhere that I think it's like a really astronomical number of people who are transitioning or have transitioned, that they have like an attempted suicide rate that's really high too.
Yeah.
It seems like it's just can't win all around.
Yeah, I would imagine that being in that transitionary phase is probably the most difficult part, right? Because I'm sure most people are very uncomfortable in the body of their born gender, but then being in that transition, you're kind of like halfway in between and like not really comfortable. And yeah, but then people who, go through the full transition and come out the other side tend to have much better outcomes. All right, so I've got to say about puberty for now. We might talk about it a little bit more in the context of emotional and social development. Well, it's not all I have to say about it, it's all I have to say about the sexual changes from puberty, at least. Puberty also contributes pretty significantly to some drastic changes in brain development. So a couple things to note. Up until early 20s, the prefrontal cortex is still not fully developed. So even for some of you in this classroom, depending on your age, you might not have a fully developed prefrontal cortex yet. And that is the part of the brain that's involved in executive control, which we've talked about multiple times, that ability to plan, set goals, self-regulate, etc. So that won't be fully developed, like I said, until about early 20s. Most of the development that's going on physically is myelination and pruning. So you've got pretty much all the neurons in place at that point, but the myelin is not fully developed. And again, myelin is the part that sort of speeds up those connections in the brain. So during adolescence, you're still having some of that development happening. The prefrontal cortex is continuing to develop, so executive control is getting better, but it's still not at its peak that it will be in early 20s. Maybe more importantly, there's also some pretty drastic changes going on in the reward network of the brain. So the reward network is a system of structures that is active whenever we do something pleasurable, basically. So this would involve like dopamine. So if you've ever heard of dopamine, this whole idea of, lots of things that are addictive tend to trigger dopamine activity. That's the neurotransmitter that's used in this particular network. And in adolescence, there's some really interesting things happening in that network that basically make it so that adolescents, when they're making a decision, they tend to weigh the rewards of an outcome way more, and they tend to discount the risks or the possible, negative outcomes of that decision. So if you have a teenager who's, with their friends and their friends are asking them to drink or use drugs or whatever, and they're making a decision about whether or not to do that, they're going to focus a lot on the reward. They're going to focus on, okay, this is going to be fun. It's going to feel good. My friends are going to think I'm cool, etc. And they're not going to think about the possible negative consequences of that because of like literal neurological, physical changes in the brain that kind of make them think that way, basically. So we're going to talk a little bit about risky behaviors that teenagers engage in. And I guess kind of the main thing I want you to think about now is that that's completely normal and it's sort of built into our brains to act that way during adolescence. So in addition, this is more relates to the prefrontal cortex stuff I was talking about. You've also got some synaptic pruning still going on in some areas and expansion in the others. So expansion is mostly happening in the prefrontal cortex. So continued changes in brain development, basically. All right. Some other physical changes that are happening in adolescence have to do with the sleep-wake cycle. And again, this is partially due to changes in the brain and also changes in those hormones that we've already talked about. And those changes sort of combine to lead to later sleep onset and also to the need for more sleep compared to early and middle childhood. So in an ideal setting, adolescents would basically be allowed to go to sleep later and sleep for longer than they did in childhood. Unfortunately, our society isn't really set up to support that, although there are some initiatives to try to change that. So in the past decade or so, I've seen all kinds of states trying to implement rules for starting high schools later and setting rules about how early they can start and having thresholds on that. But because of these changes and sort of, go ahead, Valerie.
I was just thinking about my friend who had a night job. She was a night shift worker, and her kid being on an opposite schedule was a really big pain in the ass to her, and there was no other way to I think it was pre-COVID too, so there wasn't online doing classes there, but it was a big pain in the ass, and it made me think about that. There are a lot of adults who are on a nighttime schedule, and it's just not. My husband was on a night schedule for a long time, in the military.
Yeah.
It was rough.
Yeah, it's very.
Consider that.
Yeah, definitely. It's extremely difficult. And even, outside of that, like I'm saying, pretty much all of society is set up to run from 9 to 5 or whatever, and our school systems run mostly from, 8 to 3-ish. It's just not really conducive to the development of adolescence. So because of that, adolescents are chronically sleepy, basically. As I'm sure all of you are aware and probably feeling right this moment. And lack of sleep leads to all kinds of negative outcomes. It impairs executive function, which is already not fully developed, so then that's going to contribute, again, to some of those risky behaviors. Impaired emotional regulation, also reduced achievement in school, increased anxiety and depression, and then all of that sort of combines to some of the high-risk behaviors we'll talk about in a little bit. Also, I should point out too that lack of sleep has all kinds of physical, negative outcomes. It can reduce our immune function, so we're more likely to get sick. It also has really negative impacts on the brain if you're not sleeping enough or sleeping deeply enough. There's pretty good evidence that chronic lack of sleep might increase your risk for Alzheimer's and dementia. Partially because, so while you're sleeping, your brain is actually flushing a lot of like waste material. And if you're not getting enough sleep, then you're not going through that process, and those waste materials sort of build up and cause, declines in the neurons, basically, that can lead to, like I said, Alzheimer's and dementia. So it's a really important issue.
Does it have any effect on, like, the physical growth, too? Because that's what happens when you sleep.
Yes, yeah, I mean, that's another thing that's happening while you're sleeping. Your body's, like, repairing, recovering from exercise or any other sort of damage, and also, contributing to growth. So, lack of sleep is going to impair all of that. All right. Teens also tend to have somewhat poor nutrition compared to some of the other age ranges we've talked about. And part of that is due to the fact that calorie requirements increase. So when you're going through puberty, all this growth is happening. Also high schoolers often very likely to participate in like extracurricular activities, sports, and physical education and all of that. So they need more calories, but they often are on a time crunch. Again, I always feel kind of silly talking about adolescence, like my favorite, most interesting time period, but like saying all this to all of you who are mostly in adolescence feels so silly to me. Like, this because you're living it every single day. Adolescents tend to be on a pretty big time crunch. They're going to school, they've got extracurriculars. A lot of people start working during this time period. And so trying to find time to eat even remotely healthy is very difficult. So adolescents are more likely than any other time period to eat like on the go. So eating fast food or just grabbing like, a granola bar or something to eat for breakfast. In addition to that, around this age is when eating disorders become most common, particularly in girls. So all of that can lead to poor nutritional outcomes. So you've got adolescents whose brains aren't fully developed, they're not getting enough sleep, they're not eating great. Yeah, did you have a question?
What age is adolescence?
So we're talking 12 to, like I said, researchers argue between like 19 and 21. So it can go all the way up to 21. Okay, so now let's talk about some of the kind of risky behaviors that teens engage in. Again, just keeping in mind, like, you put all these things together, I just said, and it makes sense that adolescents maybe don't always make the most amazing, great decisions. I made all kinds of terrible decisions during this age range, for sure. So adolescents engage in lots of risky sexual behaviors. About 70% of teens report that they have had sex by the age of 19. Obviously hormonal changes are going to lead to increased sex drive. And then, all the things I talked about makes it so that teens are not considering the risks of that, and they're only weighing the rewards and focusing heavily on that. We also get all kinds of messages from the media that make it seem like sex is risk-free. You see sexual things happening in movies, and they're not often concerned about protection or birth control or condoms, and it doesn't often depict, the negative outcomes that can come from that. So it often leads adolescents to think like, this is a completely unrisky behavior to engage in. And then in addition to that, I would say the sexual education in this country is pretty lacking, especially in more like rural conservative areas. And so a lot of teens are just misinformed or uninformed about the possible consequences and how to avoid them. Maybe not surprisingly, authoritative parents who have, that warm bond with their children, they're much more likely to have conversations about sex. And so their children are less likely to have negative outcomes from sexual behaviors. They're not less likely to have sex, but they are more likely to use protection and to make decisions that will help guard against the negative outcomes. Yeah?
That's something I've never really understood, why people get so like up in arms about, teenagers having sex. Teenagers have had sex since the dawn of time.
Yes, yeah.
Literally. That's what
Yeah.
It's not anything new.
Right, yeah. I I agree.
It's crazy. I'm like, oh, that's so immoral and wrong, and how dare you? I'm so shocked and surprised.
Right, yeah.
Really?
Yeah. Well, I would guess this mostly religious reasons, and that prior to pretty recently, most people would have been married by like 14 or 15. So.
But still, it's still the same category. It's teens.
Yeah. Yes. So in addition to 70% having sex by the age of 19, about 14% report that they do not use contraception consistently. Keep in mind these numbers are from self-reports, which means that everything you see here in reality is probably much higher, because there are obviously going to be teens who, even in an anonymous self-report, are not going to want to say that they've had sex, even if they had. They're not going to want to say that they're not using contraception. So about 20% of sexually active teens will get an STI or an STD, that's sexually transmitted infection or disease. And there's about 750,000 teen pregnancies per year. Also, all these numbers, I think they come from probably 2010 or so. So there might have been shifts in these numbers. I would imagine in general they were trending up. COVID probably caused a decrease in a lot of this just because the opportunities would have lessened, but then I would imagine it's probably upticking again. All right, let's see. So, full disclosure, I got pregnant when I was 19, so I would have been in this adolescent age range. But I just want to tell you a little bit about outcomes of teenage pregnancies, which are probably not surprising to you. So about 1 in 4 teenage pregnancies end in abortion. So, much more likely to get an abortion if you have an unplanned pregnancy in adolescence. About 90% of those teenage pregnancies are going to happen outside of marriage. Typically, girls who come from low socioeconomic status, girls who come from divorced parents, have poor school achievement, those are going to be the ones that are more likely to have a pregnancy during this age range. And then often both the mother and the child from the teenage pregnancy will have negative outcomes. So girls who get pregnant are much less likely to graduate from high school, less likely to go on to higher education. They're more likely to have more unplanned pregnancies after the first one. They're likely to be a single parent and to have difficulty having, healthy, strong relationships going forward. And they also tend to have financial difficulties, and they typically might have weaker parenting skills. So they're more likely to fall into either the authoritarian or the permissive parenting style instead of using that authoritative parenting style that we've talked about multiple times. So that's generally what happened. Yeah, Valerie.
Sorry.
You're good.
I watched a documentary a long time ago on child marriages in the U.S., and I had no idea that they are still legal, even below what you would expect to be maybe okay.
Right.
And there was just all the testimonies of the women who were forced to marry men who had molested them as children.
Mm-hmm.
And then they get pregnant,
Yeah.
And then they had to marry. There was a woman who got married at 11, and she had 8 children.
Oh my goodness, that's crazy.
I know.
Yeah. I mean, I know in some states that I was aware of, the lowest age was 14, but
even that.
yeah,
I guess it's still happening though. It's just,
yeah. Let's see.
Once they get stuck in a marriage like that, they can't petition
Yeah,
themselves to get out. They can't file for divorce because they're not legal adults yet either. So
Right.
it's how can you hold a child to that standard but not give them the benefits of being an adult?
Yeah. I'll have to look into that. Maybe add some stuff about it in future classes. I didn't realize it was legal that young.
Yeah. Well, that was a long time ago that woman had gotten. I think it was
Right,
in
it
the
might have
60s, but still,
right.
It's in the U.S.
Yeah. Okay, so in addition to risky sexual behaviors, adolescents are also pretty likely to engage in substance use in really risky ways. So again, got statistics here. 50% of teenagers report using at least one drug. 62% have abused alcohol, meaning that they used it to get, drunk. The earlier that you use a substance, the more likely it is that you will become addicted to it because the brain is still developing, particularly that reward network that I talked about earlier. It's the reward network that gets kind of miswired is what leads to addiction. And so if you use a substance while that area is still in development, then you're much more likely to develop an addiction from that. So that's one of the biggest risks of using drugs at this age is the development of an addiction. Yeah, so use of substances can often lead to poor decisions. You know, people who are drunk or on a substance are less likely to make good decisions because it tends to inhibit the prefrontal cortex. They also tend to have decreased academic performance and increased risk of other psychological disorders, particularly if, you know, one of the safer drugs to use maybe is marijuana. That's what we often, you know, that's going to be safer than alcohol or cocaine or other drugs. But even so, someone who uses marijuana particularly chronically or in this early age is more likely to develop schizophrenia and other types of psychological disorders.
What about mushrooms, though? Are those supposed to be good for your brain?
So yeah, I would say using any substance in this early age period is pretty dangerous. Once you get into adulthood, some of them might be safer, but yeah, in adolescence, your brain's still forming. Much more risky to use it then.
Did you say that there's a correlation between higher use of marijuana and adolescence in developing schizophrenia?
Yes, yeah. And there's some research that suggests a causal mechanism there. There's something about the way the brain affects, or the way that marijuana affects the brain.
Like triggers it?
Yeah, might trigger. Especially if you already have other risk factors to develop schizophrenia, that might be the thing that like pushes you over the edge. Yeah.
In your opinion, would you say like the effects or like I guess chances of effects of like insomnia is worse than like say weed or something?
So you're asking, is the effects of insomnia worse than this?
The
Or
lesser
worse
evil?
than the other?
Right. That's difficult to say. I mean, I think if we're looking like short-term side effects, probably, yeah. Like insomnia might be worse. But if you think about the long-term possibility of addiction, then that would tip me over to saying that maybe drug use would be more dangerous. But yeah, insomnia and chronic sleep deprivation is extremely dangerous, extremely negative on the way that it impacts brain development. So I would say they're probably more equal than most people would think they are. Yeah.
I'm pretty sure that's what killed Michael Jackson. He like couldn't sleep, and so he like kept taking more and more of his sleep meds. Yeah.
I never thought of it that way.
I'd be alive if we just used weed.
This whole class, just a PSA for weed. All right, so let's move on from risky behaviors, talking a little bit about cognitive development. So let's first look through Piaget's lens. So according to Piaget, adolescents are entering what's called the formal operational stage. So some of the skills they've developed at this time, one is hypothetical or deductive reasoning. So this is, you know, problem solving based on a hypothesis, where you form a hypothesis and then you test that through variables, etc. That all sounds very like scientific and formal. Formal's even in the name. But we do this in a lot of ways without even realizing it, in kind of more informal settings. So, you know, I might develop a hypothesis that my crush likes me, and I might test that hypothesis by texting them something suggestive, or, you know, so hypothesis testing doesn't have to mean science necessarily. It's just they're using that type of thinking to come to decisions, to understand information, etc.
Would that be more considered like a less formal version of fucking around and finding out?
Yes. Yeah. I'd say another part of this, though, is that they're able to consider multiple variables at a time and try to figure out like which variable is going to be most impactful.
I would say I use that like a lot more than I realized now that you just like described it that way.
Mhm.
Because if I ever think someone's lying to me or anything like that, I never address it right away. I always like throw in like questions or topics to be like,
Right, yeah. You're just collecting your data
Yeah.
until you can come to a valid conclusion. Yeah, yes. We do this all the time without realizing it. They also are becoming better at propositional thought, so that's the ability to evaluate more like verbal, abstract, non-tangible things. So according to Piaget, it's not universal that everyone gets to this stage. So this is the 4th stage, right? We're in the final stage of Piaget. So according to Piaget, this is like the final stage of cognitive development, but there's pretty good evidence that not everyone gets here. So some people might be stuck in the previous stage basically forever.
I think my mother is stuck in the previous stage forever. She never went beyond addition and subtraction in math.
Yeah.
Yeah.
My mom is probably similar. She dropped out of high school when she was 16, and that would have been in like the early 70s or late 70s or something like that.
Yeah,
So
late 70s.
probably, yeah. So she probably would have been, and I would assume if she had dropped out of high school, she probably wasn't in the highest math available at that time. So yeah.
Yeah, it makes
probably
you wonder, you know. And then like when they start telling you things, it's like, well, you never took any history classes in high school. Like, how do you know?
Yeah.
You don't even have internet.
Yeah.
I was really mad by pointing that out. I think she said something that I thought was really stupid, and I was like, how many credits did you get in high school? And she sent me to my room. She got real mad.
I mean, to be fair, there's lots of ways to learn outside of school, but
Yeah, she didn't do it.
yeah. Okay, so kind of broadening out from Piaget and just talking about cognitive developments in more general terms. I mean, we already kind of talked about scientific reasoning. That would fit in with the hypothesis testing we were talking about. Let's see. Some of the stuff on here is more limitation focused rather than the strengths. So adolescents in general tend to be highly self-focused. This is, again, common across generations too. I feel like this is something that older generations like to point out right now about teenagers, but like this has been true about teenagers forever. We have other terms for it now maybe, so like main character syndrome is kind of the idea of self-focusing, like this idea that the world revolves around you, that you're the main character, that you're the most important, etc. A lot of teens, what's that? We all are, is the thing. You are, but also I am, and everyone else is too. Yeah. It's funny, like my son has been calling me an NPC as an insult now.
Oh my God, that's my favorite.
Just, when I do anything that he thinks is not like interesting or whatever, he's you're such an NPC.
We joked about dressing up as NPCs for Halloween, and if we had neighbors close enough, maybe like stage it where we like just T-pose for like a long time as we pass by the window, and then when they press the doorbell, then we like get into character and we just say things like, "I can't believe it's Halloween," you know?
Yeah,
What
just
a spectacular night.
yes, yeah, it would. I would love it. Yeah, so they tend to see themselves as kind of the center of the universe. They also tend to have very idyllic views of the world. They often get into the state of feeling like they know everything, kind of. Have you all heard of the Dunning-Kruger effect?
I don't know what it is.
It's basically this idea that as soon as you learn a little bit about something, you tend to think that you're an expert in that field. And the true experts tend to realize that there's like a still massive, vast amount of information that they don't know and will never know. So people who know just a little bit tend to be way more confident in their knowledge than people who know a lot about something. And I feel like teenagers are kind of just walking Dunning-Kruger effects, like they're getting into high school, they're starting to learn a little bit about politics and history and all this stuff. And as soon as they learn a little bit, they feel like, oh my gosh, I know everything about the world, I'm so smart. And so then they have very idealistic, rigid beliefs about those things, about politics, about religion, about history, etc. And you're kind of unwavering a little bit. And that will change, we will see, as you get into, later into adulthood. So the one Taylor Swift song I do really like, only because she does it with Phoebe Bridgers, who I love. What is the lyric? It's like, how could I know? What? Oh my gosh, I'm going to blank on it now.
Can you hum a few bars?
Maybe
We got a
play it.
microphone.
It's like, how could I know everything at 18 but nothing at 22? I think is the lyric, something like that. Very much in line with this, that when you're a teenager, you think you know everything, and then all of a sudden, especially people who go to college and interact with people from other cultures and like start to broaden their perspectives, they have this moment of realizing like, oh my gosh, I don't know anything. And then the fun part is around 30, you realize like, wait, nobody knows anything. Like nobody knows what they're doing. So, yeah.
That's true.
Yes. As we already kind of talked about, adolescents also tend to focus a lot on immediate rewards. They're a little bit less great at thinking about long-term effects and consequences. And then in terms of cognitive developments, we see some gender differences in mental abilities start to emerge around this time that I want to talk about a little bit. The biggest gender difference that has been consistently found in terms of cognitive development is that boys tend to have better spatial reasoning and girls tend to have better verbal reasoning. So spatial reasoning is understanding like the spatial nature of something. So the way that they test spatial reasoning, there's a lot of ways, but one of them, they will give like some sort of drawing of like a three-dimensional, kind of like Tetris-y looking thing. Let's say like that. Okay, so you'll get this, and then there will be a bunch of kind of similar images of this rotated in different directions, except only one of them will actually be this thing rotated, right? And the rest will be kind of similar, and you have to just look at it and decide like which one is this same thing but rotated. There's another one they do kind of similar to that. Maybe I can just use this drawing. Would that work? I don't know. So they would draw something like this and say, imagine that this is a box that's been like cut and unfolded, and you're going to fold it back up into a cube, and then they'll put like 2 arrows, and they'll say, okay, if you folded it up, would those arrows meet? So it's like you're taking something, visual, and in your mind trying to spatially manipulate it and figure out how it'll go together or whatever. So that's how they tend to measure the spatial reasoning, which again, boys tend to be better at. And then verbal reasoning is things like, if you've taken like the ACT, the verbal component of that would be a good example of verbal reasoning. Or they have SAT out here, not ACT. But yeah, do they even do that anymore too? They stopped doing that during COVID. So I don't know if you guys even take like standardized testing. No, okay. I need to find another example now. It's crazy to me.
I read somewhere that men and boys tend to be more interested in things and objects, and women tend to be more interested in people.
And yeah, I think that's in terms of like conversations with other people that they have. Those are the topics that tend to come up.
Their priorities and like their interests in things. I was just talking to my husband about that too, and it's like I like this subject because it helps people, or because I get to learn about people.
Yeah.
Whereas like if a man who's more interested in things might be more interested in like the theories and development, or like the brain chemistry behind it or something.
Right. That's interesting. Were you saying something, Ashley?
Oh, I was
Sorry.
just saying the Wassel, like it's like the SAT.
Okay. Yeah. Yes. So yeah, like verbal. So whenever I took the ACT, like forever ago, they would have like analogies and synonyms and stuff, like just verbal things basically. So the interesting thing though is that there's pretty good evidence that a lot of that comes from more like societal and cultural factors than it does from biology. So they did a study, for example, where they tested men and women on their spatial abilities using a test like the one I just described. Then they had them play, so half of the men and half of the women, played a like very spatial video game for 6 weeks, like an hour each day for 6 weeks or something like that. So it was some sort of video game that involved like navigating a map in order to find something. So lots of like spatial reasoning to play it. So half of the men and women played that game. The other half played some other video game that had no like spatial reasoning behind it. And then they tested their spatial ability again. They found that both men and women had improved on their spatial ability, but women improved so much more that by the end of it, men and women were equal at their spatial reasoning. So all that suggested that maybe it's just something about, right, historically, men have been more likely, boys have been more likely to play video games than girls. That's changing now, finally, thankfully. But that used to be like a huge stereotype. I think we kind of talked about like Legos. My parents not letting me have Legos. Very same with video games. We had a PlayStation, we had an Xbox at some point. They were always in my brother's room, and I was basically never allowed to play them unless my brothers let me, which they never did because I was a little sister and they didn't like me. So I never got to play video games even though I really liked them, and play them a lot now. So some of those societal things are probably what impact those gender differences in mental abilities. And if we treated genders pretty much the same from childhood, then we almost certainly would not see those differences once you get to adolescence. All right. Any questions about physical and cognitive developments in adolescence? Mhm.
I have also read that people who have dyslexia tend to view the world and other concepts in more three-dimensional aspects.
Interesting.
Yeah,
I
my
remember-
husband is dyslexic and he flips letters and numbers all the time. He's
Right.
the world's worst speller ever, which is really hard for me.
Yeah.
But we were talking about him taking notes the other day just to remember something. He's like, "That's not how my brain works." I'm like, "Well, that's kind of how everybody's brain works. If you write it down, you're
Right.
gonna remember it." He's like, "No, I'm a three-dimensional thinker." And I'm like, "Then sculpt the fucking hours. What do you want? Just learn it."
Oh my.
Sometimes he does doodle though. He says that helps a lot. But I don't know if that has something to do with like spatial reasoning or something.
Yeah.